And good morning, everybody. It's Jaleesa from MEMA. We're about a minute away, so we'll give folks like another minute or two before we get started here this morning. Thank you. All right, it's 10:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. So again, good morning. This is Jaleesa Tate from the Maryland Emergency Management Agency. And today we are well within our BRIC Technical Assistance Series that we've been doing kind of throughout the course of October every Wednesday, just to provide some deeper dives into certain topics related to the grant programs. I do, again, just want to take it a second to pause and thank you guys, number one, for participating in these webinars. And number two, I know that as far as a lot of folks on the call probably are actively kind of preparing for some additional weather this weekend. So thank you guys for taking the time to jump on this morning. So with that, today the webinar is dedicated to the environmental historic preservation requirements for the FEMA HMA programs. And even though it's a BRIC Technical Assistance Series, I do want to stress that a lot of the information that we are giving you, it applies across the board to all the FEMA hazard mitigation. So we're very excited. We have Jen Sparingberg and Terry Rising from Maryland Environmental Service, who are going to go through the environmental historic preservation requirements, the process, and just overall, I think some really good best practices for developing these applications. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Terry Rising with the Maryland Environmental Service, and I'm here this morning to talk about the environmental and historic preservation section of the FEMA Go application. I'm about ready to go ahead and share my screen. Just a couple pieces of housekeeping. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. After the session, we will go ahead and start answering them. If you have any technical problems throughout the presentation, go ahead and put that in the chat as well. We have some folks that are monitoring it and can offer you assistance mid-program if you're having some trouble. The program is going to be about 30-ish minutes, and then we're going to leave the rest of the time for questions. And hopefully we'll get through this on time. So for the agenda this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about what EHP is, what the environmental and historic preservation section is, what is it, why is it required, the laws and executive orders that are behind the whole purpose of EHP, why it's important, and what are the different review roles and responsibilities for you as a subapplicant, MEMA, and FEMA. I'm also going to share with you some application resources that I know we've already shared, some tricks, some tools, some of the one-page sheets that are in the sub-applicant resources section of the MEMA website, and also the EHP checklist that is provided by FEMA, and we're going to go and talk about that. Also going to give you some examples of some projects that typically seem to be the most common and how to go through the EHP section for those. I'm also going to talk a bit about the photography piece, give you some basic tips and tricks for that, how to make your project stand out, how to make it, easy for the various reviewers to understand, and then some additional resources and just some keys to success. How can you make this smooth and easy for all of the folks that are involved to review your project? The first slide is dedicated to Executive Order 12372, which is a question that you will all face in the beginning of your FEMA Go. Executive Order 12372 is also known as the Intergovernmental Review of Federal Programs. I'm sure everybody knew that, which was issued with the desire to foster the intergovernmental partnership and strengthen federalism by relying on state and local processes for the coordination and review of proposed federal financial assistance and direct federal development. What does this mean to you as a sub-applicant? Not a whole lot. Just that when you begin your application, please check yes to that question and enter the date 11/22/2020, and then you're covered. So getting started with EHP review. First, the EHP section does not apply to CCB projects. So if you have a CCB project, you do not have to worry about filling out this section. 2, pre-award costs may include preparation of EHP documentation for awarded projects. And that's the key. You need to have an awarded project for those costs to be included. Projects involving changes to a structure or site may involve a higher level of environmental and historic preservation review. Projects involving new ground disturbance are evaluated for potential impact to archaeological resources and wildlife habitat. So this is one of these keys to success as a part of your application, just to be aware that you may need to go through some additional consultation depending on the nature of your project because of these various reviews. It's not a deal breaker, but you should be mindful that it will be potentially involved. A yes answer to any of the EHP questions does not mean that the project will not be funded, only that special issues must be reviewed and resolved in a satisfactory manner of funds. So when you get into FEMA Go, you'll have those lists of questions, and some of them are basically hidden to you until you check yes. And then when you check yes, it will auto-populate a series of secondary questions. Most of the time, it's just they're deep diving more into that, but you won't see them from the beginning unless you check yes. And finally, sub-applicants must provide all relevant EHP materials with your FEMA Go submission. So there are places within the application to attach all of them, and they should be attached at the time of submission. So what is the EHP review? EHP review is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, their policy to integrate environmental planning and historic preservation considerations into its hazard mitigation, disaster response, recovery, emergency preparedness activities. FEMA, through its EHP program, engages in a review process to ensure that FEMA-funded activities comply with various federal EHP laws and executive orders. The goal of these compliance requirements is to protect the nation's water, air, coastal, wildlife, agricultural, historical, and cultural resources, as well as to minimize potential adverse effects to children and to low-income and minority populations. What is NEPA? So a lot of times you see tons of acronyms. You see NEPA, you see, the Section 106, you see, numbers and letters and all of these things. And NEPA is actually a grouping of different regulations under one umbrella. It's called the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. and it requires that the federal government examine the proposed impacts of its actions before project implementation. So NEPA forms a framework, and a lot of times if you see it in presentations, you'll see it almost like pictured as an umbrella, which is actually a really good way to describe it. But it's that framework for the coordination, demonstration of compliance or consultation required by other environmental laws. So for example, the need to comply with another environmental law, such as the Clean Water Act, may be identified within the framework of NEPA, but NEPA itself is not the source of the obligation. So if theoretically the requirement to comply with NEPA were removed, compliance with each applicable law would still be required. And it's important to note that state, local, or tribal processes cannot replace NEPA compliance. However, materials prepared for other entities like the State Historic Preservation Office, the Maryland Historical Trust, which most of you are familiar with, can be submitted with the EHP review materials in FEMA Go. And finally, NEPA compliance has always been included in the special conditions of the grant award and the grant guidance. So here's a list of all of those environmental laws and executive orders that form the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So there are groups, they're grouped by sources laws, socioeconomic laws, pollution control and debris management, and finally, historic properties. So chances are good that your project is not going to check all of these boxes. It may check one, it may check a few, but you have to consider the possibility that the project may trigger one of these, executive orders or regulations as part of the review process. So as I said before, the EHP review is required, but why should you go through the trouble? Because I think a lot of people agree that it seems very, a big hurdle to your project review, but it really can improve projects when possible. So especially, I used to be a preservation planner with a county government. So I'm coming at this from your side of the virtual fence when looking at possible historic structures, looking at all of these different aspects to it and how you could improve that maybe there's something in terms of your review that you hadn't considered. There might be, kind of a different way to approach the project. And going through this review can sort of tease those things out. You also can identify issues early and avoid impacts. So if you have a project and it involves a National Register Historic District or a sensitive wildlife habitat, you want to know these things early and consider what that means to your project. It also helps you plan for additional budget costs. So if there are any compliance, studies or investigations that come along with your project, you can factor those in as a part of the budget costs. Finally, the most important thing, it's the law. You have to do it. You can't avoid it. But hopefully we're going to do everything we can to try to make it as easy for you to get through this as possible. And probably aside from being the law, it also is essential for you to retain your funding. If you don't satisfy the EHP process, you don't retain the funding. So for the purposes of BRIC, these are the various review roles and responsibilities for this process. And it is confusing. Again, having come at it from your side of the world, from the county side, it can be, there's so many different state agencies and federal government. So this kind of tries to boil it down a bit, just to pull out like who does what. So as a sub-applicant, the responsibility is to use this EHP screening form, which we're going to talk about in a little while. And it has a checklist with it to identify applicable regulations based on the proposed project description and location. So you're going to look at your project, go through these different questions, and make sure you find all of the resources that are available to, basically say, yes, it's a sensitive wildlife area, it's, an endangered species habitat, or, it's on the National Register. You're going to, your responsibility to identify things. Secondly, you're going to develop the appropriate materials for that EHP review, maps, photos, drawings, materials. And then completing the EHP section of the sub-application in FEMA Go with all those necessary attachments. So you're basically getting all of those pieces to the puzzle together and putting them in FEMA Go for MEMA and FEMA. MEMA will review your application package for completeness to ensure that all of the necessary environmental review information and documentation is included. MEMA will also initiate the state clearinghouse project submission process, which some of you may be familiar with, and that's a whole other thing. And MEMA will coordinate with state agencies as needed. And finally, all of the state sub-applications and the associated EHP documentation to FEMA. So they're going to take everything and send it off in FEMA Go, because FEMA Go seems to be working well for that. Finally, FEMA will ensure that the project complies with the federal laws and executive orders. So they're going to go back and look at all of the things that you checked off and make sure that, column A equals column B. If necessary, they will also conduct site inspections and coordinate these activities with the state. And they will also provide technical assistance to the state and to the sub-applicant if necessary, depending on the project. And finally, they'll coordinate consultations with other federal agencies if necessary. So, some of the questions that I've seen so far from the sub-applicants, it's do I need this and do I need that? And in reality, there is no one size fits all answer. It's, what happens in this EHP process is entirely dependent on the nature of your project. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about some resources that you can use as a part of application and putting it into FEMA Go. The first thing is this EHP screening form. It is a form created by FEMA. It is designed to really sort of walk you through the process of identifying all of these things and knowing the type of materials that you need to submit as a part of the FEMA Go application. Is it required? No. Will it help you? Absolutely. And it's worth taking the time, especially since there are so many different, moving parts, and you may have to talk to this person or go here and there. And this at least helps you keep things in order, which is really important. Because at the end of the day, your job is to explain your project to FEMA. You need to be able to provide to them everything you possibly can to tell that story, to explain what you want to do, where you want to do it, how you want to do it with this FEMA Go application. So providing all of the materials, knowing exactly what they're looking for is really, really essential. And the screening form is supposed to help you walk through this process, make it easier for you, but also most importantly, easier for FEMA when it comes to reviewing your project. So the EHP screening form is a questionnaire used by FEMA to facilitate the environmental and compliance review for your projects and to determine which regulations are applicable to the project. The screening form and associated materials may be included as an attachment to the sub-application in FEMA Go. And again, it's not required, but it's strongly encouraged to complete it. However, it's important to note that the screening form is not a substitute for answering the questions within the EHP section in FEMA Go. The screening form and attachments provide supporting material to positively answer questions within the sub-application. But it helps you plan, it helps you do that hunting and gathering you need to do to find the pieces to submit with your application. The form provides technical guidance for supplemental documentation, including guidance for supporting photographs for project submission. We're going to talk a little bit about that later on, but they do have some basic guidance that I sort of adopted for this program in that form at the very end. And all projects are assessed under the NEPA framework and the National Historic Preservation Act, which a lot of people know it's just Section 106, but that's the National Historic Preservation Act, regardless of the scope of work. So it may not have any effect. It may have an adverse effect. but it needs to be reviewed regardless. So the type of information that you're going to put in the EHP screening form is very similar, if not identical, to what's in FEMA-Go. You're going to find the location of the structure facility, the GPS coordinates, if you don't have an address, a project location map, all of those important things. And again, a lot of you are probably really used to using GIS, but it's also important to note that having a very clear map, being able to, for them to identify the project area, the structure, making that as clear, making a good map is really important. Also adding who's the point of contact for the project. Very important for the Section 106 process is the date of the structure, when it was constructed. Also the detailed scope of work. What are you doing? Where are you doing it? And how you are doing it? And again, you're telling that story about your project for FEMA. And you may even want to go back and consult your hazard mitigation plan. You probably all know it by heart, of course, but you might find some language in there about your particular project, especially if it was identified in there. It may help you explain it well, very clearly, reuse that language if you have it. So it's your hazard mitigation plan may also be a helpful tool for you as you're going through this process. You're going to add clearly labeled color photographs showing the exact location of activities. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that later. For ground disturbances, dimensions, acreage, square footage of structures and/or land affected. So even if you're installing a generator and you're basically you're disturbing that ground to put in a pad or put in, whatever electrical you need to do, that's a ground disturbance. So you do need to identify that as part of your activity. Again, a project site map with areas and activities labeled, including any equipment or material staging areas. This is really important, especially if you are near a sensitive historic or environmental area, because where you may put construction equipment, there are, policies and regulations and good practices for, not putting your construction, equipment, keeping it on a wetland or keeping it on a cemetery or, somewhere that it can do secondary or inadvertent damage to something that's sensitive. And also design drawings, if possible, showing where equipment will be installed or activities. So getting back to that, telling that story, having design drawings, good design drawings that explain what you're doing, what materials you might be using, how you're going to implement your project is really, really important. And even if you can't, you don't have the opportunity to provide professionally designed drawings, there's a lot of things that you can do to make sure that whatever you're submitting is very clear, understandable, that any measurements or any, all of that makes sense. So this tool and information sheet is a part of the sub-applicant resources through NEMA's website. And what we've done is basically gone through the different sections of the EHP section and have identified different websites or sources of information that you may consult to find that information for those questions. It's important because there are so many GIS applications out there, and I'm sure you've run into that, and trying to make sure that you're getting to the best source, the most accurate. If you're not sure, definitely check last updated dates. And again, too, if you're not sure, you can always go back to the agency that generated that data to make sure that, yes, what you're providing is the most updated information. So, for example, again, coming at it from a preservation standpoint, you go to, the Maryland Historical Trust website, their Medusa GIS interactive application they have, and you go there and say like, oh, I need to know if this property is on the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties or in a National Register district, and you don't see it for some reason, you may want to check with them. Or if you as a county have a local preservation map or a local My Neighborhood kind of thing, you want to make sure that whatever you have matches whatever they have, because as the generating agency, the source of that information, you know, they are the primary source for this. So it's really good just to go back and double check. So talking a little bit more about the EHP review and all of those questions. So these are the primary laws and executive orders that form the basis of FEMA's EHP review. So endangered species, migratory birds, historic preservation, clean air, clean water, farmland, different executive orders, environmental justice, floodplains, wetlands, Coastal Barrier Resources Act, and Coastal Zone Management Act. And I think a couple of these they're coupled together within the FEMA Go questionnaire. So first, talking about the National Historic Preservation Act, this is always applicable to the project, regardless of whether or not it involves a historic structure. The intent of the National Historic Preservation Act is that federally funded projects shall consider project impacts to resources eligible for listing or listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and that includes archaeological sites. So any structure that's 50 years of age, even though it could be theoretically now a McDonald's, you're going to need to go through this just to have an evaluation to make sure that McDonald's or that gas station or whatever isn't eligible for the National Register of Historic Places or listed. So the type of information that's usually requested as a part of the review process is, as I said earlier, the date of construction for each building involved in the project, a diagram or quad map, a consultation letter or other information about potential historic or archaeological properties in the project area. It's possible, especially if this is an area that has been the subject of other past floods or other environmental issues, it may have actually gone through some level of Section 106 or NEPA review previously. So if you have any documentation about that in your files, it's important to include that or note it. You also want to identify the area of ground disturbance, again, for archaeology or potential archaeology, and any past uses of the disturbed area. So if you know that, somewhere on this property, there used to be an accessory structure or another house or something along those lines, it's important to provide that information as well. So any historic buildings or structures that may be affected by a mitigation project must be named in the sub-application. Historic structures more than 50 years of age include more than buildings. They include historic districts and any object of historic importance. So again, more is more in this case. Make sure you identify everything that could potentially be involved. If a project will affect archaeological resources, the resource must be named in the sub-application. Be aware that because known archaeological resources may be considered sensitive information, a SHPO or a tribal historic preservation office may relate concerns but might not have access to that information, which is another reason that you can suggest that maybe you think this is an archaeological area, but that is a part of that later EHP review process. FEMA can confirm that with either the SHPO or the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. So another act that typically comes up as a part of a lot of these projects is the Endangered Species Act and the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. So this is not always required. It's applicable based on the project. The intent is that federally funded projects shall seek to avoid adversely affecting threatened and endangered species and their critical habitat. The information typically required for this is, again, maybe a consultation letter or other information about threatened or endangered species in the project area. Chances are good, again, it may have gone through some level of review or you have information about it from past project reviews or plans. Information about threatened or endangered species or bodies of water in the project area and the potential of the project to impact these species. And again, a site map. The timing of construction for some projects may coincide with critical nesting or migratory patterns of endangered species and wildlife. In these cases, delaying construction until after these periods may mitigate their potential impact, and the time frame can be incorporated into the project schedule. Which again, going back to an earlier slide, talking about finding this information out from the get-go, because this can help you plan your project and build this into your time. The Clean Water Act, the Rivers and Harbors Act, and Executive Order 11990, the protection of wetlands taken together. This is also an as applicable grouping. The intent is to protect the nation's water resources. Together, they support the navigability, let's see if I can say this, navigability, there we go, I can say it in my head much better, of the nation's waterways, control proposed development on or around navigable channels, and clean and maintain the water quality of the nation's waters. The information typically required for this is, again, a topo map or an image, a wetlands map, and again, going back to that tool sheet, we have places where you can find this information, and a consultation letter or other information about wetlands or waters of the US in the project area, which again, you may have somewhere else. The Clean Water Act also has a permitting system under the direction of the US Army Corps of Engineers. Any wetlands that may be affected by the project must be shown in the sub-application. For example, the proposed design for a drainage improvement project may destroy or impair a wetland area, so it's important to include that information as a part of your EHP review. Executive Order 11988, floodplain management, again, as applicable. The intent is that federally funded projects shall avoid adverse impacts associated with the occupancy and modification of floodplains whenever there is a practicable alternative. Again, information required, maps showing floodplains and floodway designations in the project area. We provided some links for you to find that information, and documentation of probable floodplain management impacts in the project area. And Order 1988 is separate from the National Flood Insurance Program. However, the floodplain maps and information produced for the NFIP are excellent resources to use for estimating impacts to floodplains. Floodplains, floodways, drainage areas, watercourses, etc., within proximity of the project location must be shown. There is a good possibility that the project area of a flood mitigation project will be located within a regulated floodplain area. But even though flood mitigation projects will result in reduced flood risk to structures or an area, floodplain management requirements must still be followed. So to use as an example, an elevation project. These are fairly typical as a part of hazard mitigation grants. And so I pulled one of these out just to kind of give you an idea of what the typical pieces of information that you're going to want to provide for these type of projects. So again, most of this is previously covered ground, but the location of the project, the site address, the GPS coordinates, any maps, the flood insurance rate map with the project site clearly marked, aerial imagery, drawings showing the location of the properties to be evaluated. And again, this is one of these times where having a really good and clear map is important. A contextual map is really useful because then they can see it's not only like you just kind of zoomed up to that little parcel, you want to make sure that you have the parcel clearly depicted, but that you have the larger context as well for them. Provide a scope of work for the project, including plans for the type of elevation, any planned demolition, level of ground disturbance, extent of vegetation removal, and any fill to be used. Specific design information will be required should EHP review identify potential adverse effects on buildings listed in or eligible for the National Register, either individually or as part of a district. Also, again, the age of an existing building is critical. Provide the original date of construction for any buildings or structures located on the list of proposed properties to be elevated. Submit clear color photographs of each building elevated, including one photo for each side of the building. Provide color photographs of the surrounding neighborhood taken from the site of the buildings to be elevated. So again, that contextual review. Include copies of other relevant information, such as environmental site assessments and remediation reports, historic property designations or surveys, including any archaeological survey that you may have in your files. And to note that structure elevation projects generally fall under FEMA's list of categorical exclusions that require minimal documentation to comply with NEPA, but compliance with other laws and regulations like, again, the Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera, are still required. The categorical exclusion that FEMA has is basically, it's in a nutshell, it's how they classify different projects to kind of smoothly go through that NEPA process. So it's sort of a programmatic way to consolidate reviews in one place and somewhat expedite things. So for example, using the National Historic Preservation Act to consider an elevation project, the NFIP floodplain management requirements contain provisions that provide relief from the elevation requirements for historic properties located in special flood hazard areas. However, if the applicant and owner decide to proceed with elevation of a historic property, they still must meet the requirements of the National Historic Preservation Act, i.e. go through Section 106. Because elevation may alter the appearance or scale of this historic building and redefine its relationship to the setting, it may have a negative impact on the building's character-defining features. When planning the elevation of flood-prone structures, FEMA advises communities to consider utilizing appropriate design, materials, and landscaping to avoid adverse effects to historic properties. And this graphic kind of shows you different sorts of foundation construction that you're going to be describing with your project scope, what to look at. And by adhering to the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, which is the foundation for Section 106 and the National Historic Preservation Act, by minimizing elevation, a building's original historic setting, scale, and distinctive features may be preserved, which will reduce the project's likelihood to have potential adverse effects. So I know a lot of times when I was doing these kinds of reviews from my project side of things, if it involved a historic property, it was often, not met with a great deal of enthusiasm. But, there's a lot of ways that you can still go through, an elevation project or other similar projects involving a historic property, as long as you're mindful of these various elements that go into that review and considering that as a part of your project planning. So if you are elevating some structures that, now have a cohesiveness along a streetscape, to be mindful that when you elevate them, that they still need to be compatible. They still need to have that relationship to the street. And they still need to have a height that is consistent with the overall streetscape pattern in the community, especially a district. And this little graphic kind of shows you that about how the elevation can affect a setback from a street, how it can look, in comparison to structures around it. So if you have a streetscape that goes and then one big house, those are kinds of things you want to try to avoid. If you are raising it, there's a lot of ways to soften that look. You can use vegetation, use appropriate and compatible materials. Those kinds of things can really mitigate and avoid any adverse effect that could result from the elevation project. Next, considerations for acquisition and demolition projects. This is also a fairly common project that we see. And again, most of this is something familiar to you. Where is it? What is the address? Maps, age of construction for the building or any buildings, on the site to be acquired, the scope of work, and very importantly, including the plans for demolition, the level of ground disturbance, the extent of vegetation removal and grading plans, not only because of the structure itself, but potential for archaeology. This information needs to be sufficient to provide a clear picture of the scope of the action being reviewed. And also, if there's any wells, septic, heating, cooling, any sort of functioning units or even non-functioning units, you need to identify those things within your scope of work because they're going to need to be removed and there may be remediation involved. You want to provide clear color photographs of each of the buildings to be acquired, including one photo for each side of the building. Include color photographs of the surrounding neighborhood, again, that context, taken from the acquisition site. Clearly label photographs with the location and orientation of the camera relative to the property to be acquired. So if you're looking at the facade of a structure and you say, picture one primary facade of, 123 Main Street looking north. So providing as much information as possible to that reviewer is really important for them to kind of get that mental picture of, where you're looking. Having done enough of these photographs myself, it's easy to think like, yeah, I know that's north, I know that's west, but, going back and looking at it, either later on or from, the perspective of someone who's not as familiar with their community, it may not be as clear to them. So getting back to that more is more, this is another time where really more is more. Also to include copies of other relevant information, such as environmental site assessments or remediation reports, historic property designations or surveys, or archaeological surveys that you may have. And when acquisition and demolition projects are most likely to impact historic properties, state and local governments must also consider federal, state, and local laws that relate to the project area, floodplains, wetlands, endangered and threatened species, critical wildlife habitats, different soils, water, air quality, low income and minority populations, and other resources. So there's other regulations under the EHP process that acquisition and demolition also is reviewed aside from just the National Historic Preservation Act. But in this case, considering National Historic Preservation Act for acquisition and demolition, removal of structures from the areas of risk is the most permanent form of hazard mitigation. While this may be the most practical solution for buildings subject to repetitive hazard events and that have sustained extensive structural damage, demolition of individual historic buildings or multiple buildings within historic districts have serious ramifications. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier about elevating those, doing an elevation, removing a structure like potentially leaves, it's pulling a tooth, you're hole there. And if you are removing a number of structures, let's say in a historic district, you potentially have the ability to undermine the historic integrity of the overall historic district and cause an adverse effect. So, trying to be mindful of that in the planning process is really essential to at least, facing these issues up front, or maybe considering another, alternative to demolition. When planning an acquisition of a hazard-prone structure, FEMA advises communities to ensure that no physical actions occur before historic buildings and archaeological resources are identified and environmental compliance review is complete. And that basically speaks to the concept of preemptive demolition. So basically, don't start demolishing things that, might be something down the road. Don't take all the, if the house and there are historic, outbuildings, don't demolish those first. Preemptive demolition is generally not a good thing. Where technically feasible, other options besides acquisition and demolition should be considered for historic structures. The earliest portion of this building, this is from the state's Maryland Historical Trust flood hazard, their guidance document. This warehouse was originally in a flood area, still is in a flood area, but it was adapted to be a visitor center despite the risk of flooding. So underneath there are flood openings that are visible, and the building was saved. It was adaptively reused in spite of it being in a sensitive area. A decision to demolish should be made only after extensive research of the historic property or district has been completed in order to fully understand the significance of the building or buildings that would be lost. Because again, it's permanent, it's final, there's no going back once it's gone. So going through some general photography guidance for the sub-application submission, again, there are some guidance principles in that EHP screening form, which I'm basically going over, but in the case of most of the properties in your applications, the photographs will be the only and final record of the properties. So again, tell that story. They need to tell that story to someone who isn't as familiar with your community as you are. Clear and easily understandable photo documentation is essential in assisting project reviewers. As the agency with oversight over the National Historic Preservation Program, the National Park Service does provide guidelines and expectations on the quality of photographs and documentation as it relates to historic structures. And it's good because FEMA's recommendations for photograph standards are consistent with those in order to facilitate any historic property consultations between FEMA and the SHPO, the Maryland Historical Trust. If you've ever been through that process, you know they're very particular. So you want to make sure that you're getting everything you need up front so you don't have to go back and do it again. And if you are unclear if a photo is acceptable, refer to FEMA's guidance in their EHP screening form and/or consult the EHP staff at FEMA. Proper photographs following these guidelines will be required again. So here are some basic, composition and quality do's and don'ts. Most of these are very intuitive, but, just to kind of reinforce that, do make sure your application has review quality digital color photos of every property. Please name them appropriately, address the side of the building, north, east, south, west, so 123 Main Street, looking west, that kind of thing. When possible, orient your photos of landscape horizontally, if possible, because it provides the most space for content in the photographs. And if it's a house, a lot of times making sure you get that primary facade or any of the elevations of the house, it's the best way to communicate that in the photo. Do provide JPEGs or TIFF files of photographs. Scans of photographs from appraisal documents or application pages and Google Street View screenshots will not suffice for SHPO review. This can be achieved by submitting the original photographic files directly from your camera, from your digital camera or phone. So having that phone now has really been a game changer if you've had to do this for a long time. So, again, some basic do's and don'ts. Don't have people in the photograph. This includes, the owners, bystanders, the project staff, and I hate to tell you, but also please don't try to have animals in there. I've been in a lot of situations where, I got to get the dog out of the picture and it can be really difficult. So plan ahead. Don't have obstructed views of buildings if possible. This includes tree coverage, car windows, things from the street, such as a storage container or dumpster. Taking photos from multiple viewpoints may be necessary. You can see from that picture right there, whatever is being shot is hidden behind that giant tree. And then there's cones and other things in the picture. Don't supply scanned photographs. Scanned photographs mean the quality of the photos is lost, not only once through the printing, but twice through the scan. This leads to the photos being grainy, too blown out, or too dark. And don't digitally alter the photographs in any way, cropping, resizing, obscuring people. Don't put them in there in the first place, and then you don't have to worry about it. So some other quality do's and don'ts. Do take pictures of all four sides in their entirety of the subject buildings and applications. Include outbuildings such as garages, barns, sheds, etc. Make sure you get those windows, those shutters, those doors, the chimney, all of those things need to be in there. Do make sure there's adequate lighting in the photos to ensure the features of the buildings are legible. Sometimes, if the weather isn't cooperating, you may have to go back out. Do take photos from an angle which gives a clear representation of the building. Do include photographs of the surrounding streetscape for the property. This provides context again. Do verify that each subject property and the project is represented in the photographs and that the supplied photographs are of the correct building. It sounds, unlikely, but it is possible, especially if you're doing a big project. And as an example, these two shots, the do is taken from the front view. Photo has a landscape orientation, provides a complete representation of the structure. You can see its relationship to the sidewalk. You can see all the windows, doors, everything very clearly. As the don't, this photograph is crooked. You can't see it. You don't see the street, or you don't see the frontage. Not a good picture. And some photo, tips for infrastructure projects because they, are larger scale. It's not necessarily a house. Provide photos of limits of disturbance of the project area and surrounding areas. If multiple sites are in an application, make sure you have accounted for all sites. So if you are, doing an elevation or an acquisition project of multiple sites, on your GIS map, make sure that each one are clearly depicted, and even better, make sure that they're keyed in such a way that match the photos. So whoever's reviewing it, they don't need to ask questions. They've got the whole story there. Do provide photos of the ground if ground disturbance is involved. And again, these photos should provide context and show surroundings. So just some basic, principles to make the EHP reviews go smoothly. So again, complete and attach the EHP screening form to your FEMA Go application, and provide well-organized attachments that are clearly named to aid the female reviewer. They're reviewing a lot of projects. There's a lot of moving parts. So as easy as you can make it for them, that will really make for a smoother review. Conduct initial background checks for projects with buildings 50 years or older and new construction projects with ground disturbance to learn if the property or site has a historic designation. Again, you're planning to plan. You want to know if you're in a historic district, do as much of that legwork as possible. Your state and local preservation or planning agencies are absolute major resources for known historic properties and archaeology sensitive areas. Especially if you are a county that has a local preservation program, you may have locally designated districts or resources that aren't also in the National Register. So you are going to want to make sure that you talk to your other local preservation planners or planning agencies to identify any potential historic or archaeological sites that could be, eligible or listed under your own county program. Provide well-designed maps with areas and activities clearly labeled. Again, identify any equipment or material staging areas. Submit professionally designed drawings when possible. And if you can't do that, at least make sure the drawings are very clear, crisp, and understandable. And finally, some keys to success. Again, legwork up front can shorten project review timeframes. More is more. Give them more. Answer questions based on known information. Do not guess or assume. If you don't know the age of construction, consult the State Department of Assessment and Taxation. Sometimes it doesn't have the date of construction, so there are other resources that you can use to check into finding out when that date of construction is. You can also contact, especially if it's relating to a historic property, contact the Maryland Historical Trust as the SHPO, or your local preservation or planning agency. And well-written project descriptions along with clear, well-labeled maps and photos aid NEMA and FEMA staff during the evaluation process. Complete scopes of work and clear documentation equals EHP review foundation. So again, you're telling that story, you're painting that picture for them. So you want to give them as much information as possible. And some more information, here's the link to the grant, sub-applicant resources, the EHP assistance site at FEMA, the checklist and screening form, that's the direct link. And of course, everyone's favorite FEMA Go, there's the link to FEMA Go. The Maryland Historical Trust is an excellent flood mitigation guide that I referenced earlier, especially if you're proposing a project that has to do with elevation or acquisition and demolition of a historic property. Really, really good stuff. And finally, if you have questions about the EHP review process, you can actually email FEMA directly at that email address, and there should be someone there that can help you. So that is the end of the program. And if you have any questions, we can try to answer them now. And if you have questions that aren't answerable now, we'll do everything we can to find an answer for you. So thank you again for attending today, and I hope this was helpful. This will also be available through that sub-applicant resource page, and the video will be posted.
Yeah. And Terry, we have a few minutes left, so we can take some of the questions that have been in the chat, because there were a few things that I wanted to take an opportunity to expand upon as well too. So we've been answering some of the questions in the chat. We have one from Paul Emart. So it says, for a roadway project on public land, how can we estimate the age of this infrastructure asset? And for houses or businesses nearby but not on the site of the construction site, what radius distance is appropriate from the site to include in our research? Or is it a house/business not on site excluded from this review process? So I'll let you answer and then provide some tangible examples that we have gone through too.
Okay, I think I'm going to kind of take, this question in a couple parts, if I understand it correctly. So if I understand the question, it involves state-owned structures on state-owned land that are a part of a project with unknown ages. Is that correct? Did I hear that correctly? Okay, so if they are part of the Maryland Department of Transportation, State Highway Administration, you can also consult their cultural resources staff at SHA that can help you with that. Chances are good they're going to be involved anyway, because state highway projects or any MDOT projects are also looked at under NEPA. So you may want to have a conversation with the cultural resources staff in the project planning and engineering division at SHA. So that was the first part. And then can you tell me the second part of the question again?
Yep. So the second part was like, as far as structures that are not physically being impacted or within the defined project area, is there like a certain radius for those? And then I have a real world example for that too. So is there a certain distance that you need to be aware of?
Well, there's a limit of disturbance for the project. So, the limit of disturbance may also may include like staging. It may not include the actual project itself. So you're going to want to consider that limit of disturbance. And again, it isn't a one size fits all. So, you could be doing a culvert repair, and that limit of disturbance, is really limited to that culvert itself. And, just in that immediate area. But if the culvert is located in front of a historic property, and the historic property looks out in that culvert, it's very likely that that area of potential effect is what it's called for historic review, would include that historic structure. So it's on a case-by-case basis. But, again, a lot of it is actually tied to, what is your limit of disturbance, where's your staging area, and what the actual, scope of work is for the project.
But the issue wouldn't be that you need to take a bunch of pictures of the historic house. Really, you want to take photos that show, in this example, the culvert in relation to the historic house, and perhaps the view from the historic house out as it is now and as it is proposed with the culvert, because the impact is to the setting of the house rather than the house itself. If that makes sense to folks.
And yes, that would be correct. And again, I also say, more is more. You don't want to go out of your way, but, if you're not sure, you really should double check with the cultural resources staff or the State Historic Preservation Office, MHT, because, I did that job, and there were times where, they wanted pictures that I hadn't considered. So.
And there was a question further down that also kind of speaks to this. Brad Rogers asked, do we have to include 3 side color photos of historic buildings nearby if your project is not going to touch or affect them, but rather protect them? So again, it's the same kind of issue where you don't necessarily need to record all of the buildings, but you might need to record the view from the buildings to what you're doing, and the view from what you're doing to the buildings, because you're affecting the historic setting.
Yes. And again, if you don't know and you're there, take the picture anyway, if it's feasible to do so.
All right. And we might have time for like one more question before we wrap up here. So there was another question, and this one, Terry, it might be more so like a technical question for the FEMA Go system versus an EHP question. But the question was essentially for like community scale projects, what address or latitude and longitude should they use? Or is it something where you don't need to be specific, but if you kind of give like the center of the project site, that's acceptable?
This came up, I think this question came up in an earlier training session about using multiple structures. And I think if I remember correctly, FEMA Go does give you the ability to include multiple addresses. You know, I would say if you have to verbally define a project area, you know, if you are 20 feet north of Main Street and, you know, 50 feet west, you know, there's a way to kind of verbally also describe that project area. So you could, you know, visually depict it on a map and then verbally describe what that is based on the, you know, the meets and bounds or just, you know, feet.
And Terry, this is Amy. One suggestion as well is, while I believe FEMA Go does allow you to enter multiple addresses, if it does not, and there's a lot that everyone's still learning about FEMA Go, if it doesn't allow you to enter multiple lat longs for, let's say, to go with those multiple addresses, I think the best suggestion would be take one of your addresses, right, and match to that corresponding lat long, and then again put all the lat longs for your project in either the project description and the project map that you have, clearly show them, and add a note, in this case more is more, you know, and clearly state the boundaries of your of either your community-wide project, and give the lat longs that define the perimeter of that boundary for the community project, or the multiple site locations, and put that in your description of the scope of work so that it is upfront and very clear. And you can even add a note if it does, just saying that the system wouldn't allow you to enter multiple locations. But I think that's a learning experience that we're going to see on the lat long to the address component.
And that also would you want to make sure it's consistent with the BCA. Am I correct in that?
Yes, you are correct. And so I think that's where, again, where you tie in your description for the locations in your project scope of work, if you write that up first, that ties in well, supporting your EHP documentation and your BCA. So that kind of serves as your foundational document that goes outwards.
All right, perfect. So we're 2 minutes out now, so I'm going to wrap us up. But again, if anybody has additional questions, please email mitigation.mema@maryland.gov. When you email that address, there is somebody dedicated to check that email address and make sure your question goes to the right individual, versus it all coming to me and it kind of being buried under a lot of like non-related FEMA Go and BRIC stuff too. So if you'd like a quicker response, please email mitigation.mema@maryland.gov. I think the most important takeaways from today are definitely the documentation aspects. So the clear digital pictures are very essential. We've literally had people submit over 100 photos only for them to have to go and retake every single photo and label them differently. And that in addition to the photos, if you have the ability, like do a screenshot of the aerial view of the project site from Google, submit any type of design and engineering plans that you already have. And then the last plugs are going to be for FEMA Go. So if you haven't registered for FEMA Go, please do so. I can tell you it has not been an easy process, and in some cases it's taken multiple days to get people into the system. And then the second thing is that I put the link in the chat for the FEMA Go sub-application development guide. So we've been receiving a lot of very individual questions as far as like, this question says such and such, do I select yes or no? Or kind of like, can you elaborate on what this question is asking? The FEMA Go application, sub-application development guide, it actually expounds upon every single question that is asked throughout the sub-application. So I would really encourage you all to consult the development guide first, because a lot of the times, because like literally some of the stuff is really simple. So a lot of the times it's going to be me just copying what's in the guide and sending it back to you, because that is the actual answer to your question. So just kind of thinking about all of our partners and making sure that MEMA is able to provide, you know, a high level customer service to everybody. Strongly encourage everybody to look at the guide first. And then if you have subsequent questions or need further clarification, feel free to reach out. But other than that, that is all that we have today. So thank you guys again. And everybody stay safe this weekend with the weather we have coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.